a key point of differentiation for sales is your ability to tell a great story. Whenever I go out to the field and ask, what are best practices that have helped you be successful Netapp, selling Netapp, one of the things that I hear is it's the ability to tell a great story. I'm here today with two master storytellers, and what we're going to do is have an informal discussion, share some ideas, and at the end of it, you should have some new great ideas on how to make stories your own and tell great stories. So I'd like to start with Luke. And Luke, you have some ideas about why it's so important, or not just ideas, but I think some research that tells us why stories make an impact in selling.
Yeah, and storytelling is being studied now beyond just, we know that humans tell stories, and we've actually learned some really important things about how stories are, how they impact people. One way they impact people is they actually activate brain centers that are related to the content and the material. So, and in sales that's really important, because if you're just reading bullet points about something, it's kind of dry, and we've had that dry feeling where our brains aren't being engaged. A story will actually engage your audience. And the second part of this is that when you're telling a story to more than one person, the act of engagement is not just with one person, it's with the room. So you start to synchronize people into your message as opposed to having people wander off in their own ways. But the thing that I kind of find delicious about storytelling is that when you tell a compelling story, it becomes business gossip. And that gossip gets shared. And that's important for salespeople, because let's say a salesperson goes into an account and presents the Netapp value proposition and says, well, here's my slides. And salespeople do that all the time. Well, those slides never go anywhere, because even if your champion in your account buys into what you're saying, they're not going to show your slides, because then they just look like a shill for Netapp. But if you give them stories, they can share the stories that you shared with them, and it becomes part of the communication process, and it expands within that account.
I think the bit about gossip and it's more small talk, really, because it changes and allows you as a salesperson to change the venue in which you're selling. It's no longer necessarily in the conference room with the PowerPoint slides. But I was at the Agile Executive Forum back in August in Texas, and I remember talking to a number of executives, and it was really interesting because you get to talking about what's really important to them, and suddenly you can use stories to highlight things, and they've been Netapp customers. And this is, I think, the really strange thing is I was talking to a guy from Fidelity. He'd been called on by Netapp for years. He'd been hearing about what we do. But when he was telling me about his problems and about how they weren't agile enough and they were really struggling with how long it took to set something up, set up environments for doing development and test, I was able to relate him the ING story and say, well, Netapp helped another bank or another financial institution really reduce the time. We went from 12 weeks down to 10 minutes. We went from 3 environments to 450. And the guy's jaw dropped. He's like, 450? That's amazing. That would completely support what we're trying to do. I'm assuming you can do more. I said, it's dependent upon the environment size, right? And so it was a way of kind of being able to subtly connect his needs with what we've accomplished and done, and do it in a way that he's going to remember. And in fact, he wrote this beautiful email back to me and thanked me for it, and he showed me what he had told everyone else inside of Fidelity around that.
See, that's really interesting, people repeating other people's stories. And we all do fight for mind share with our customers, right? And the ability for our customers to share stories. But it's not just our customers who we want to share stories. It's also internally. So we have these epic stories, for example, and not everyone can tell them. One of the things that you've been able to do so well, Paul, is you can take other people's stories, and you've been effective in telling those to customers so they resonate, and you make them your own. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your process of how you do that, because it would be great for everyone in our sales force to be able to take some of these amazing win stories and talk to them, to their customers.
The one that immediately leaps to mind is Thomson Reuters. And I remember when we were first writing the Agile Data Infrastructure whiteboard, and I started watching and reading the material around Thomson Reuters, it really intrigued me because there was something way down buried in the videos where they talked about how with Netapp they were able to rapidly prototype new search algorithms, new features and functions, and bring them to market fast, which told me they were doing agile, right? Well, then I started looking at it further, and at the very end of the video, lawyers are gushing, or they're telling, actually Thomson Reuters is telling about how lawyers will write in wanting to marry Westlaw Next, or these other ridiculous things, and all I could sit there thinking, going, really? I don't really believe that. So I called a couple of my friends, and I sat down with some of my friends who are lawyers, and I started asking them questions about Westlaw Next. And I was amazed at the responses I was getting. They're like, oh yeah, I've heard of Westlaw Next. It's worth its weight in gold. It's the most amazing thing. They made it like Google for searching. And that was to me a huge insight. And then I started asking another lawyer, I said, well, why don't you just go to Google? And he started telling me about, well, I could go to Google and spend 6 hours and I wouldn't be near as prepared as if I just spent 30 minutes on Next. And I realized I now had some personal information that I could share in a compelling way, because the real story of what we did with Thomson Reuters wasn't necessarily that we had saved them a $65 million data center buy, or that we had enabled them to search 5 billion records, both of which are really important facts, but that we had changed Westlaw Next's fundamental value proposition in the marketplace. Thomson Reuters, in working in partnership with Netapp, had fundamentally changed that. And that was a discovery process I went through by asking people what they thought of the product and then being able to relate the stories. So, technically, at the time, I'd never met anybody from Thomson Reuters. I'd never met anyone from the Thomson Reuters team until recently. But I was able to go look at other aspects of it and own the story myself by asking people what they thought of it and then gaining insight that way.
And so you collected data that made you feel comfortable.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I went out and asked other people, and not only did it help me confirm our story, but it completely shaped the story in a completely different way.
Well, so I'd like to now get to shaping stories, and how do you, we talked a bit about how do you take stories and make them your own, but how do you make your own stories?
Well, if you kind of deconstruct what Paul was talking about, there's two elements there. There's a fact and a factual foundation, which makes the story interesting in business, and then there is an impact of the facts, or the effect of those facts. So, and then finally you sprinkle in some emotional words. So earlier in our talk, I used the word delicious, and you kind of surprised at the word I used, but of course it's activating a brain center, delicious. And Paul talked about the lawyers marry, and that's activating the brain center around marriage and the commitment and what that relationship means. So when you're looking at what makes a compelling story, you start with, well, I have these facts, but then I'm going to have this higher level impact, and then with that higher level impact, you can use that to make the connection with the person you're sharing the story with. So, Paul, one of the things that I saw you do at the executive forum at the Agile conference was you talked with Sue McKinney from Pitney Bowes, and you were able to relate the story to her. So tell everyone how you started that process, because I think that was the act of not just making the story your own, but how do you tell it back?
Well, with Sue, it was, so Sue's the vice president of development at Pitney Bowes. And she and I got to talking because she had given a wonderful presentation and where she'd talked about everybody needing to be agile, and she'd named off the development organization, sales and marketing, HR and legal, and she'd left IT out. And when I went and asked her about, well, why'd you leave IT out, her response was unprintable or unrepeatable. And it was something to the effect of, I just don't even want to have conversations with them because all they care about is reducing cost, and I can't transform the company with just a cost reduction story. And so I got to listening to that, and then I was telling her about ING Direct, because that was one of our best stories at the time. And I could see her nodding and all these sort of things. And I asked her, I said, what about this is resonating? And she goes, I care about two things more than anything else. Productivity. I have 2,500 people on my team. And if I can make them as little as 20% more productive, which the stories you're telling me would definitely do that, that's like having 3,000 people for the price of 2,500. She goes, but even more importantly, Pitney Bowes is kind of the 21st century buggy whip maker. We make physical mail systems for post offices. that's going away. Denmark, you won't be able to send a letter in Denmark after 2015. You can't send personal email. I'm like, oh my God. She goes, so if we're not first to market in the digital mailing world, we're going to fail. And so I was able to confirm, as you're saying, that me talking about productivity and time to market weren't just empty buzzwords to her. That was something that she told me. She goes, I literally think nonstop about how to improve those two things.
Okay, but this makes me think about something else that we talked about earlier. How do you use a story to say something to a customer that would normally be threatening or provocative?
And that's interesting. I think why you brought up the Pitney Bowes thing. So I was able to take those blankers in IT in context, and now because I'm telling the story, I was able to transport it, and I was in front of the Salesforce.com executives at an executive briefing back in January, and it gave me a safe way to essentially lay that out on the table of, is this how your business thinks of you, in such a way that I'm not being accusative and I'm not laying something horrible there. I'm relating what somebody else has said about it, and I could see by the nods on the head of the Salesforce people that I had hit home without hitting home.
Right.
Which is really, I think, one of the truly powerful things about stories is that ability to do that without hurting.
I agree. I think that's why people at Netapp have found stories so important, because sometimes we're taking our customer to places they couldn't have imagined were possible, and you don't want to make them defensive about it.
Right, and notice that when Paul was talking to Salesforce, right, it's when a company like Netapp has to a customer an absolute breakthrough, the Netapp, it's easy to get it tripped up into, well, we're 5 steps ahead. And in many cases, Netapp is 5 steps ahead because you have this breakthrough technology and people haven't realized or learned about what Netapp can do for them. And so what happens is when you're kind of this PowerPoint-driven push sales culture, you just walk in and you say, well, you should buy our product because we're obviously better. And people don't dispute that, but you haven't drawn them in. And so the first thing that Paul is doing through the storytelling is, first he's curious. What would Sue be interested in? Oh, she's interested in productivity gains. Let me talk about factual stuff about productivity gains and communicate it in a story. But he's not telling, he's not asserting, he's sharing a path, and that path leads people through the arc of the story, which is, here was the problem, and here's what was going on, and here's the resolution, and that resolution had a business impact. And as you're going through that path, the person who's listening to the story can follow that path with you, and now they can buy. Because if you walk in and just say, I got better stuff, buy, well, they haven't taken the journey with you, and so they're not ready. They're not catching up to you.
And that's exactly what happened with Mike Valente at IBM. So I've got this one slide that I use to position all of Netapp, and I was at a dinner meeting with Mike, and Mike is the VP of Cloud at IBM, very, very senior executive, and Paula Carpenter had me out for dinner with him, and I pulled out the slide but I did it in a different way because I really wanted him to pay attention, but I wanted him to do it, and I wanted to take the sales thread off of it. And I said, hey, I just came up with this concept. You're a very senior executive at one of our key partners. Could you help me and let me know if any of this resonates with you? So we start working through it, and I didn't know where it was going to hit with him, but because I put him in kind of that consultative mode, I got around to talking about how Clayton companies had used Snap Restore to take the risk out of deploying new software. Because I was telling the story about how, Clayton developed this new ERP system, and they were doing development in the morning, testing at lunch, released to production in the afternoon. And I'd asked their CIO, I'd said, well, Scott, isn't that kind of risky? And he goes, oh, you don't understand your own value proposition. That's what Snap Restore is for.
Okay.
And I just can roll back. Well, I'm telling this story to Mike Valente, and Mike was like, hold the phone. You guys can do that? And he stopped my whole thing. He goes, you guys can do that? And I know he's probably heard about Snap Restore bajillions of times. But because he heard about it in the context of another CIO using it to de-risk his application platform, he goes, do you know why that's so important to me? Because he's starting to get really excited. Mike is. And I said, no, I don't. He goes, I'm doing a 1.1 release of our platform this weekend. I'm not concerned it's going to go bad. I know it's going to go bad. And what you're telling me is I could have a way to, it's like a do-over. It's like a mulligan in golf. It's like being on the playground and yelling do-over, and I want to do it over, because that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. And he turned around to Paula and he says, set me up a meeting. I need to unpack this with your entire meeting. And I need to understand this. My whole team needs to understand this.
So what you're saying is that you can use stories, and actually people start selling themselves because they see the value. Our time is almost up, and I want to end by asking both of you to give some advice to our listeners. If you had to net it out, just brief advice to them on how do we all get better telling stories, what would you say?
Be humbly curious.
Okay.
Be willing to ask the question that feels like it's the stupid question in the room. Because just because you don't understand is not a bad thing. And especially if you express that to your customer, they're going to feel touched that you're curious about their business and truly want to know something so that you can help serve them better.
Okay, so not what you'd expect to hear about storytelling, but it's a great piece of advice. And
yeah, and my advice for the sales force, because we all travel a lot in sales and things like that, is every now and then just give yourself the opportunity to read some stories. Maybe not the big long novels. I actually read a lot of short stories, just because they're things that you can consume, and you learn the art of storytelling when you can read some.
So two great perspectives on not just focusing on how to tell the story, but understanding who you're telling the story to, and then continuing building your knowledge of what makes a great story by reading. Thank you so much for being here with us. And I challenge everyone watching this, find a story within the Epic Stories or within Evidence Bank and make it your own and start talking to customers about it. Thanks so much for your time.